In the winter of 1878, a single act of kindness could get you killed. Out in the Dakota Black Hills, it was a death sentence waiting to be signed. And for a widow named Elizabeth Linwood, clinging to the homestead her husband left behind, the executioner was on his way. She wasn't looking for trouble, but when a blizzard hit, a true monster of wind and ice that just swallowed the whole world, trouble found her. It came in the form of two small frozen shapes she almost mistook for snow-covered stumps right at her fence line. They weren't stumps. They were two Sioux boys, lost, and just a breath away from the end. Saving them would mean turning her back on her neighbors, on the law, and on a past so violent it was still an open wound across the territory. But leaving them to die, that would mean losing the last little piece of her own soul. This isn't just a story about a blizzard. It's the true story of how one woman's choice brought a warrior to her door. Not looking for a fight, but to settle a debt. A debt that could only be paid in blood and trust. The wind wasn't just wind, it was a living thing, a predator prowling the edges of the Black Hills. Its voice was a low, guttural moan that promised to wipe everything off the face of the earth. For 2 days it had clawed at the log walls of Elizabeth's cabin, looking for a way in, a crack in the armor of her solitude. The world outside her two small windows had vanished, replaced by a churning, angry vortex of white. Ellie, as her late husband Caleb had called her, was 32. But the Dakota sun and a grief that cut right down to the bone had carved lines around her eyes that made her look older. Every move she made was deliberate, calculated. A log for the fire, a scoop of flour from the barrel, a trip to the small attached shed to check on her goat and 3 chickens. It was all about saving energy, about surviving. Caleb had been gone 2 years, taken by a fever that swept through the small settlement near Deadwood. He'd left her with this 160-acre homestead, a cabin he'd built with his own 2 hands, and a loneliness so deep it felt like a physical weight on her chest. Everyone told her she was crazy for staying, a woman alone, in Sioux country. The wounds from the Little Bighorn, just 2 years past, were still festering, still raw. "Go back east, Elizabeth," they'd said. "Sell the claim." But this land, this cabin, it was all she had left of him. Leaving would be like burying him all over again. So she stayed. Her only companions were a Winchester rifle propped near the door, a scruffy mutt named Buck, and the ghosts of a happier time. On the 3rd day of the blizzard, the wind's howl rose to a piercing shriek. The snow wasn't just falling anymore. It was being driven sideways, piling into massive drifts that buried fences and reshaped the land into something alien and hostile. Ellie had just finished a meager meal of salted pork and hardtack when Buck, who'd been dozing by the fire, shot his head up. A low growl rumbled deep in his chest. "What is it, boy?" Ellie whispered. Her hand, without even thinking, went to the worn stock of the Winchester. Buck padded to the door, whining. His tail gave a short, uncertain wag before tucking between his legs. He scratched at the thick wood. This wasn't the aggressive bark he used for coyotes, or the excited yelp for a rare visitor. This was a sound of confusion, a sound of distress. Ellie pressed her ear to the door, but she couldn't hear anything over the storm. "There's nothing out there but death, Buck," she said. But he wouldn't settle. He whined again, more insistent this time, looking from the door to her with pleading eyes. Against every rational thought in her head, she gave in. The moment she unlatched the heavy bar, the cold blasted into the cabin like a physical blow. It stole her breath and stung her eyes. She pulled her thick wool shawl tighter around her head, peering into the blinding chaos. "See? Nothing?" she started to say, but the word died in her throat. Through the shrieking wind, she heard it, a sound so faint it was almost a hallucination, a high, thin cry, like a lamb, almost ripped away by the gale. Buck heard it too, and let out a single sharp bark. Ellie's heart hammered against her ribs. No person in their right mind would be out in this. It had to be an animal. A cougar, maybe. It could be a trap. The smart thing to do, the safe thing, was to slam the door, bolt it, and pile furniture against it. But the cry came again, weaker this time, and it sounded less like a lamb and more like a child. "Lord have mercy," she breathed, the words turning to frost in the air. In that instant, she made a decision that defied all logic, all instinct for self-preservation. Grabbing the coil of rope she kept by the door, she tied one end to the iron door latch and the other around her waist. It was a lifeline, her only chance of finding her way back. With the Winchester in one hand and a lantern she knew would be useless in the other, she stepped out into the white death. The wind nearly knocked her off her feet. The snow was past her knees, and in some places, the drifts came all the way up to her waist. She couldn't see more than 10 feet in front of her. Buck plunged ahead, his barks her only guide as the rope played out behind her, a fragile thread connecting her to the warmth of the cabin, to life itself. She stumbled, falling hard into a drift, the snow cold and suffocating. For a terrifying second she panicked, flailing in the white powder. Then her hand found the taut rope. She pulled herself up, gasping, her lungs burning. This was madness. Utter, complete madness. She found them not 20 yards from her own fence line, which was now completely buried under the snow. Buck was digging frantically at a small mound, whining piteously. At first, all Ellie saw was a heap of what looked like frozen buffalo hide. Then she saw it. A hand. A small brown hand. Fingers curled and blue with cold. Her blood ran cold. She dropped the rifle and clawed at the snow with her bare hands. First one body, then another. They were boys. 2 of them, dressed in buckskin leggings and tunics, their black hair matted with ice. And they were Sioux. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. Everything she had been taught, everything she had been warned about, screamed in her head. The stories of raids, of Custer, of the constant, simmering fear that was a part of daily life in the Black Hills. These were the enemy. The younger boy, who couldn't have been more than 5 or 6, was unconscious, his face a pale, waxy gray. The older one, maybe 8 or 9, had his arms wrapped around his little brother in a final protective embrace. His eyes were open, but they were glazed, unfocused. A faint, rattling breath escaped his lips. Ellie looked at their faces, stripped of all politics and prejudice by the brutal hand of the storm. They weren't warriors. They weren't a threat. They were children, and they were dying on her doorstep. In that moment, there was no choice. Not for a woman who had prayed for a child of her own and been denied. Not for a woman who understood loss down to the very marrow of her bones. With a surge of adrenaline she didn't know she had, she got to work. She looped the rope around the older, heavier boy and began to drag him, her boots sinking deep into the snow with every agonizing step. The 20 yards back to the cabin felt like 20 miles. She hauled the first boy onto the porch, then untied the rope and plunged back into the storm for the second. When she finally slammed the door shut and bolted it, she collapsed against it, her body trembling with exertion and cold. On the floor before the hearth lay the 2 frozen boys, artifacts of the storm delivered right to her door. But she knew with a certainty that chilled her more than the blizzard ever could, that the real trouble hadn't been the storm outside. It was just beginning. She stripped them of their frozen hide clothing, her fingers clumsy and numb. Their skin was shockingly cold, mottled and pale. She could barely find a pulse on the younger one. She wrapped them in her warmest wool blankets, even taking the precious quilt her own mother had made from her bed. She propped them near the fire, close enough to feel its heat but not so close as to burn them. The next hours were a frantic, desperate battle against death itself. She warmed broth, forcing it drop by drop between their blue-tinted lips. She rubbed their hands and feet, trying to bring life back to the frozen flesh, praying under her breath, a constant, desperate whisper. Please, God, please, not these 2, not now. As the hours bled into one another, a change occurred. The waxy gray of the younger boy's skin slowly, miraculously, gave way to a faint reddish flush. His breathing, once shallow and ragged, deepened into a steady rhythm. The older boy stirred first, his eyes fluttering open. This time, they were focused, and they were filled with a terror so profound it silenced the howling wind outside. He tried to scramble away, to put himself between Ellie and his brother, but he was too weak. Ellie held up her hands, keeping her voice low and soft. Easy now. You're safe. You're warm. He didn't understand her words, but he understood her tone. He watched her every move, his dark eyes suspicious, wary. He was a cornered animal, a tiny, exhausted warrior still standing guard over his charge. Ellie looked from the boy's frightened face to the Winchester leaning against the wall. She had brought the enemy into her home. But as she looked at them, two small boys wrapped in her dead mother's quilt, she knew she had done the only thing she could, and she would face whatever came next. Outside, the blizzard raged on, but inside the small cabin, a far more complicated storm was just beginning to gather. The blizzard broke on the fifth day. It didn't so much end as it collapsed from exhaustion, leaving behind a world remade in white and crystal. The silence that followed was immense, heavy, broken only by the drip of melting ice from the eaves. For Ellie, that silence was more menacing than the storm's roar. The blizzard had been a shield, an excuse. Now, under a sky of blinding blue, her secret was exposed. The boys were recovering. The color had returned to their faces, and the broth had been replaced by a thin stew, which they ate with a silent, desperate hunger. The younger one, Maddo, had thawed both physically and emotionally. He now watched Ellie with a wide-eyed curiosity, his fear replaced by a child's simple acceptance of warmth and food. He'd even given her a brief, shy smile when Bucket licked his hand. The older boy, Setan, was another matter entirely. He remained a fortress of suspicion. He sat upright, a blanket draped over his shoulders like a king's robe, his eyes tracking Ellie's every move. He was the protector, and he had not relinquished his duty. He spoke only to his brother in the soft, flowing cadence of their native tongue, a low murmur of reassurance. Communication was a slow, painstaking pantomime. Ellie would point to the water bucket. "Water," she'd say, enunciating clearly. Setan would just stare, his expression unreadable. Maddo, however, would point and repeat the sound, clumsy on his tongue. A small bridge was built, one word at a time. Food, fire, blanket. The first true crack in Seitan's armor came not from a word, but from a piece of wood. Ellie, sitting by the fire, took out Caleb's old pocket knife and a block of pine. It was a habit, a way to keep her hands busy and her mind from wandering down dark paths. She was carving a small bird, its wings outstretched. Maddo watched, fascinated, crawling closer until his chin rested on his hands. When she was done, she smoothed the rough edges and held it out to him. He took it reverently, his small fingers tracing the shape of the wings. Then he chirped, a perfect imitation of a meadowlark. Ellie smiled, a real, unburdened smile for the first time in days. She looked over at Seton. The older boy was watching, and for the briefest of moments, the suspicion in his eyes was replaced by something else, a flicker of respect. He gave her a curt, almost imperceptible nod. It was more eloquent than any word of thanks. But the fragile peace inside the cabin was a stark contrast to the danger lurking outside. On the sixth day, she saw it, a thin plume of smoke rising from the chimney of the Gable homestead, a mile down the valley. That meant Agatha Gable would soon be on the move. Agatha was the town's self-appointed moral compass and chief purveyor of gossip, a gaunt, severe woman with eyes that missed nothing and a tongue that soured milk. As if summoned by the thought, a sharp, impatient knock came at the door late the next afternoon. Before Ellie could even think of a lie, Seitan had grabbed Maddo, pulling him into the small sleeping loft and drawing the thick curtain she'd hung there. Ellie opened the door to find Mrs. Gable standing there, wrapped in a thick fur coat, her face pinched against the cold. "Elizabeth," she said, her voice devoid of warmth, "came to see if you were still among the living." She peered past Ellie into the cabin, her eyes scanning everything. "I managed, Agatha," Ellie said, blocking the doorway as best she could. "So it seems," Mrs. Gable sniffed. "Smells like you've been cooking for an army. Must be lonely. All that food for one." Her eyes darted to the 2 extra blankets folded by the fire, to the small, empty bowl on the table that she hadn't had time to clear away. Then her gaze lingered on the pair of small, worn moccasins tucked beside the wood box. Ellie's heart froze. She'd forgotten the moccasins. I like to be prepared," Ellie stammered. "You never know." "Indeed," Mrs. Gable said, a thin, knowing smile playing on her lips. "One never does. I saw tracks near your fence line. Small ones? Too small for a man." Her eyes gleamed with malice. "There's talk, you know. The road to Deadwood is finally clear. A war party from Spotted Tail's agency reported 2 boys missing from their winter camp. Children of a chief, no less. Their brother, a warrior they call Wanbli, has sworn to find them. He's said to be formidable. You wouldn't want to be caught in the middle of something like that. The veiled threat hung in the air, cold and sharp. Mrs. Gable knew. Or at least, she suspected enough to make trouble. "Just looking out for you, dear," she said, turning to leave. "After all, we must look after our own." The moment the door closed, Ellie sagged against it. Her safe little world had been breached. The story would be all over Deadwood by nightfall. People would come. The sheriff, maybe. Or worse, vigilantes who wouldn't bother to ask questions. Up in the loft, Seaton had heard it all. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone of the visitor's voice. The fear in Ellie's. When he came down, his face was grim. He walked to the table, took a piece of charcoal from the hearth, and began to draw on a piece of smooth bark. He drew 2 small stick figures and a larger one. Then he drew another man. This man was different. He was drawn with angry, jagged lines. He gave him a hat and a long coat and put a rifle in his hand. Seaton made a sound, a low, guttural hiss. He pointed at the angry stick figure. "Whitmore," he said. The name was like a stone hitting water. He then drew a picture of a teepee and another figure lying on the ground. He drew the man named Whitmore standing over the figure. Then he drew the 2 small stick figures running away into a swirling vortex of lines that represented the blizzard. The story was suddenly, horrifyingly clear. They hadn't just been lost. They had been running, fleeing this man, Whitmore. The blizzard hadn't been the thing that almost killed them. It had been the thing that had saved them from him. And Ellie's problem had just grown infinitely larger. She wasn't just hiding 2 lost Sioux boys. She was harboring fugitives from a killer, a white man. A man who, if he found them here, would not hesitate to kill all 3 of them to cover his tracks. Miles away, a lone rider pushed his horse through the deep, glittering snow. He was a tall man, his face weathered and grim, his eyes as dark and sharp as an eagle's, scanning the horizon. This was Wanbli. He had been riding for 3 days, his heart a cold knot of fear for his younger brothers. He had followed their trail until the blizzard had erased it completely. Now he was moving on instinct and prayer, riding towards the faint plumes of smoke from the white settlements, a place he despised, a place he knew his brothers would have avoided unless they had no other choice. He rode not as a warrior seeking war, but as a brother seeking his blood, and he would let nothing and no one stand in his way. His path was converging on a small, isolated cabin, where a lone woman was about to discover that an act of mercy had just become an act of war. The 3 days that followed Agatha Gable's visit were a study in suffocating silence. The world outside was pristine, a landscape of dazzling white under a vast, indifferent blue sky. But inside the cabin, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Every sound was magnified. The soft scuff of Matto's mended moccasins on the floorboards, the crackle of pine in the hearth, the whisper of wind around the eaves. Each noise was a potential harbinger of doom. Ellie's routines were now sharpened by a new cutting vigilance. When she fetched water from the well, her eyes weren't on the bucket but on the dark, silent line of pines that marked the edge of the clearing. She chopped wood with her back against the cabin wall, the Winchester always within a few feet. She was no longer just a woman surviving. She was a sentry on duty, and her small homestead had become a watchtower. A silent, profound understanding had grown between her and Seaton. The boy's watchfulness now mirrored her own. He would sit for hours near the window, not with a child's curiosity, but with the grim focus of a scout. Sometimes their eyes would meet across the room, and in that shared glance, a volume of unspoken words would pass. Are we safe? Not yet, but we are ready. Her fear for them had transformed into something fiercely protective. They were no longer just 2 lost Sioux boys. They were Seaton and Matto. They were under her roof. They were her responsibility. The arrival came, as such things often do, not with a bang, but with a sudden, unnatural quiet. It was just past dawn. The air was sharp and crystalline. The birds, which had been tentatively chirping, fell silent all at once. Even the wind seemed to pause. Buck, who had been dozing, lifted his head from his paws, not with a growl, but with a low, uneasy whine. The fur on his neck ridged slightly, and he stared at the door as if he could see through the solid oak. Ellie's blood went cold. This was it. "Loft," she commanded, her voice a low, urgent rasp. "Now." Citan, his face instantly pale but his movements sure, grabbed his little brother's hand. He didn't question or hesitate. He scrambled up the ladder into the small sleeping loft, pulling the thick curtains shut and plunging their hiding place into shadow. Ellie's hands, slick with a sudden sweat, closed around the familiar, solid weight of the Winchester. She moved to the side of the window, her body pressed flat against the logs, and peered through the narrowest of gaps in the curtain. He was there. At the far edge of the clearing, partially shielded by the trunk of a massive ponderosa pine, sat a rider on a paint horse. He wasn't a prospector or a trapper. He sat his horse with a stillness that was part of the landscape itself, a man who belonged to the rock and snow in a way no white man ever could. He was wrapped in a thick buffalo robe, his long braided hair catching the first rays of sun. A single eagle feather was tied in his hair, a mark of authority and power. Even from 100 yards away, his presence was overwhelming. He was a force, coiled and waiting. This had to be Wanblee. He nudged his horse forward, breaking from the cover of the trees. He didn't ride fast, but with a slow, deliberate purpose that was far more terrifying than a charge. His sharp, dark eyes weren't just looking at the cabin, they were dissecting it. He scanned the chimney for the thickness of its smoke, the roof for its condition, the ground for the faint, disturbed patterns in the snow she had tried so hard to erase. This was not a man who missed a single detail. He was a hunter, and he was tracking his quarry. What did she do? This wasn't a faceless marauder from a Deadwood gossip tale. This was a brother searching for his kin. But he was also a Sioux warrior in a land where that title alone was enough to get a man shot. If she revealed the boys, would he see her as a savior or a captor? If she hid them, would he tear the cabin apart to find them? He dismounted with a fluid grace, his feet making no sound on the packed snow. A bough was slung across his back, and a long knife was sheathed at his hip. He began to walk toward her home, his gaze locked on the front door. With a deep, shuddering breath, Ellie cocked the Winchester. The metallic click-clack was an obscene violation of the morning quiet, a sound of irreversible commitment. Wanblee stopped 20 feet from the porch. He did not shout or threaten. He simply stood there, a figure of immense, patient menace. His stillness was a challenge. He knew. He knew they were inside. Minutes stretched into an eternity, the silence a taut wire between them. Ellie knew this standoff could not last. Taking a final steadying breath, she unbolted the heavy door and opened it just enough to push the long, dark barrel of the rifle through the gap. "State your purpose," she called out, her voice stronger than she felt. The warrior's piercing eyes met hers. They held no surprise, only a vast, soul-deep weariness, an agony of not knowing that was banked by a burning anger. He spoke in the low, guttural cadence of the Lakota language. The words were a sharp, demanding fusillade of questions she couldn't understand, but whose meaning was brutally clear. "Where are they? What have you done with them? Tell me before I tear this place apart." "I don't understand you," Ellie said, her grip tightening on the rifle stock. "If you're looking for two boys, they are here. They are safe." Her words did not soothe him. His face hardened into a mask of granite disbelief. A white woman with a rifle claiming his brothers were safe. It was the oldest lie, the cruelest trick. He took a single, deliberate step forward. "Stay back." Ellie's voice cracked with strain as she raised the rifle to her shoulder, the iron sight lining up with his chest. "I don't want to hurt you, but I will. So help me God, I will." It was an impossible tableau. The lone, desperate woman defending her home, and the grieving, desperate warrior trying to reclaim his family, both trapped by a history of violence and mistrust. The standoff was shattered not by a bullet, but by a child's cry. "Wanblee!" The voice, small and clear, came from the cabin's doorway. The curtain to the loft had been pushed aside. Little Maddo, his face streaked with tears of fear and hope, was peering down. The moment his eyes locked on the man in the snow, his entire being transformed. Pure, unadulterated relief washed over his face. He scrambled down the ladder with impossible speed, his only thought to get to his brother. He ran right past Ellie, a small brown blur, and launched himself from the porch into the warrior's arms. The iron mask of Juan Blee's composure finally cracked. He dropped to one knee in the snow, the great buffalo robe falling open as he enveloped his little brother. His arms, which looked strong enough to fell a tree, were impossibly gentle. He murmured to Maddo in their language, his deep voice thick with emotion, his large hands roaming over the boy's head and back, checking for injury, for any sign of harm. Seaton appeared at the doorway behind Ellie. He did not run. He stood straight and tall, a small, solemn figure, shouldering a great burden. He looked at his older brother, who was still kneeling, clutching Maddo as if he were the last precious thing on earth. And then Seaton began to speak. He pointed a finger at the vast snow-covered landscape, his voice filled with the memory of its biting cold. He pointed at his own thin chest, his gestures telling of hunger and exhaustion. Then he turned and pointed his finger directly at Elizabeth Linwood. He spoke for a long time, his voice rising and falling in an earnest, unbroken stream of Lakota. He pointed to the hearth, to the empty stew pot, to the warm blankets. He was telling the story, the whole story. As Seaton spoke, Juan Blee's gaze slowly lifted from Maddo and settled on Ellie. The raw fury in his eyes began to recede, washed away by the tide of his brother's testimony. It was replaced by a profound confusion, then a dawning, reluctant understanding. He was truly seeing her for the first time, not as a faceless enemy, but as the woman his brother was describing. He saw the exhaustion etched around her eyes, the stark fear she was still trying to master. He saw the worn calico dress and the calloused hands of a woman who worked hard. And he saw the Winchester she still held, noting for the first time that its barrel was now pointed safely at the ground. Slowly, Juan Blee rose to his full, imposing height, with Maddo clinging tightly to his leg. He looked from Ellie to the sturdy cabin, to the thin, life-giving smoke that curled from its chimney, the beacon that had saved his blood. He spoke again, just one word in his own tongue, his voice no longer a challenge, but a raw, open question. Ellie understood. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. "They are safe," she repeated, her voice now soft. "But there is more. We are not safe. There is danger." She stepped back from the doorway, pulling the door wide open. It was the greatest risk she had yet taken, an invitation across a chasm of fear and blood. It was an offering of truce. For a long, agonizing moment, Juan Blee hesitated. To enter a settler's home was to cross into the heart of the world that was devouring his own. But his brother stood on that threshold, alive and warm. He looked at Saitan, who met his gaze and gave a single, solemn nod of confirmation. Trust her. With a final glance at the wilderness that had almost claimed his family, Juan Blee, the formidable Sioux warrior, stepped over the threshold and into Elizabeth Linwood's home. The air inside was warm and smelled of pine and stew. His eyes took in everything at once. The blankets by the fire, the small carved bird on the mantel, and on the table, the piece of smooth bark covered in Saitan's charcoal drawings. He saw the stick figures of the boys, the swirls of the blizzard, and the third figure drawn with angry, jagged lines. The monstrous man with the hat and the rifle. Juan Blee's breath caught in his throat. He strode to the table and stared down at the drawing, his face hardening into a mask of recognition and pure hate. He pointed a finger at the crude image, his voice a venomous hiss. Whitmore. The name hung in the air, a shared curse. The fragile gratitude of the moment was instantly incinerated by the heat of the shared enemy. Juan Blee looked from the drawing to Ellie, and his quest changed in a heartbeat. He had ridden for days to find his family, to offer thanks or exact vengeance. Now he saw that he was here to do both. His journey had not ended at her door. It had led him to the eve of another battle. The air inside the cabin grew thick, heavy with a tension far denser than wood smoke. The fragile peace had evaporated, replaced by the grim metallic certainty of impending violence. Juan Blee's presence, which had at first been an intrusion, now felt like the cabin's central pillar. He moved with a predator's economy, his silence more potent than any shout. The canyon of culture between them remained, but now they had a singular, desperate reason to bridge it. On the rough-hewn floorboards, using a charred stick from the hearth, they held their council of war. Juan Blee, with Saitan acting as a hesitant, wide-eyed interpreter, scratched out the story that gave their dark shadow a terrifying form. He confirmed the name, Declan Whitmore. He drew a crude symbol for a government treaty, then slashed a line through it, a promise broken. He drew Whitmore's face, a contortion of angry lines, and next to it, the figure of a proud man with a feathered headdress. He laid his hand over the second figure. 8, he said, the Lakota word for father, his voice a low rumble of granite and grief. He described the ambush not with words but with swift, brutal gestures, a hand indicating a lie, a sudden strike, a fall. As he did, Satan's face crumpled, and he buried his head in his older brother's side. Juan Blee's arm wrapped around him, a shield of muscle and buckskin. He looked at Ellie, his eyes burning with a cold fire. He didn't need to explain the rest. She was harboring the last 2 witnesses to a murder, and the killer was coming to silence them forever. Whitmore will come, Juan Blee stated, the 3 English words landing like coffin nails. He pointed a long, steady finger out the window toward the vast, glittering expanse of white. He follows tracks. He is a snake in the snow. A cold knot formed in Ellie's stomach, but it was threaded with something new, defiance. This was her land, her home. Caleb had poured his life into these walls. She would not let a man like Whitmore defile it. He won't be expecting to find you here, she said, her voice finding a strength she didn't know it possessed. She knelt, taking the charcoal from his hand. He'll be expecting a lone woman and 2 scared children. She altered his drawing of the terrain, adding a deep wooded gully to the west of the cabin. He will come from there, she said, pointing, under cover of the trees. Juan Blee studied her addition, then looked at her with a flicker of new respect. She was not just a soft-hearted woman. She understood the land, the way of the hunter, the mind of an ambusher. He nodded his assent. An unspoken command structure clicked into place. He was the general of this war, but she was the master of this fortress. The hours that followed were a blur of grim, purposeful activity. There was no time for fear to take root. There was only work. Together they dragged the heavy oak table Caleb had built, wedging it against the front window to create a solid barricade. Juan Blee moved through the cabin, his warrior's mind transforming everyday objects into instruments of defense. He pointed to her water buckets, making a gesture of dousing a fire. Ellie understood immediately and began filling every pot and pail she owned. While she worked, he took Caleb's old hunting knife, and then with the precision of a surgeon, carved 3 small, nearly invisible firing slits into the log walls, one facing west, one south, and one beside the door. They were low to the ground, offering protection and a clear line of sight. When he finished, he walked over to where her Winchester rested. He didn't grab it, but simply gestured, a silent request. Ellie nodded. He lifted the rifle, his hands treating it with the reverence of a fellow craftsman. He checked the action, sighted down the barrel, and gave a single approving nod before placing it back. In that small gesture, a profound understanding passed between them. He was entrusting her with the defense of one flank. He was treating her not as a liability, but as a fellow soldier. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the snow, a heavy blanket of dread settled with the falling temperature. They ate a thick stew in a tense, profound silence. The boys, sensing the shift in the air, were huddled together in the loft, their usual chatter silenced. The attack came with the rising of the moon. Buck shot to his feet, a low guttural growl vibrating through the floorboards. Juan Blee was on his feet before the first bark escaped the dog's throat. He flowed like smoke to the western wall, a living shadow. "They come," he breathed. Ellie's heart seized. "The cellar," she commanded in a harsh whisper to the loft. "Go!" She grabbed the Winchester, the cold steel a shocking, solid reality in her trembling hands, and took her position behind the oak table. She peered through the narrow gap between the table and the window frame. 3 riders materialized from the darkness of the trees, their forms stark against the luminous snow. The man in the lead was huge, a bear of a man wrapped in a long coat. Declan Whitmore. Linwood! His voice was a bull's roar, a sound meant to shatter resolve. I know you're in there. My trackers followed the little heathens right to your door. I've got no quarrel with you. Send them out now, and I'll let you live to see the sunrise. Finding her voice, Ellie shouted back, the words tearing from her throat. They're just children. Leave them be and ride out of here. A harsh, ugly laugh echoed across the clearing. Those children are a loose end. Now send them out, or by God, we're coming in. The night exploded. The sharp crack of a rifle was followed instantly by the meaty thump of a bullet, slamming into the log wall, just inches from Ellie's head. Splinters rained down on her. The siege had begun. What followed was a descent into a nightmare of sound and fury. Gunshots ripped through the night, chewing at the cabin's walls, shattering the small pane of glass that remained of her window. Inside, Wanblee was a whirlwind of lethal grace. He moved between the firing slits, a phantom in the firelight. The smooth draw of the bowstring, a moment of absolute stillness, and the near-silent hiss of an arrow slicing through the air. A moment later, a choked cry would echo from the darkness, followed by the blessed silence of one less gun firing upon them. Ellie, her initial terror burning away into a core of cold, hard rage, found her rhythm. Kneeling behind the table, she became an extension of the Winchester. She didn't fire wildly. She breathed, sighted, and squeezed the trigger, making every one of Caleb's precious cartridges count. She was no longer just a widow. She was a homesteader defending her claim. One of Whitmore's men made a mad dash for the door. The heavy oak shuddered under the impact of his shoulder. Before he could strike again, Wanblee's knife flashed in the narrow slit beside the doorframe. The man shrieked and stumbled back into the darkness, clutching a ruined arm. They were holding. They were actually holding. Burn them out! Whitmore roared, his voice thick with frustration. A fiery comet arced through the sky, a torch made of oil-soaked rags. It landed squarely on the sod roof with a soft thump. Smoke, thick and greasy, began to curl toward the moon. The roof! Ellie cried, her heart lurching with a new kind of terror. Fire was an enemy they couldn't fight from within. Wanblee didn't hesitate. Stay down, he commanded. He launched himself up the ladder to the loft, shoved open the small hatch Caleb had built for roof repairs, and slithered out into the treacherous, moonlit open. He was a perfect target. Instantly, the remaining rifle cracked, the bullet thudding into the roof scant inches from his leg. He ignored it. With one of the water-soaked blankets, he beat at the spreading flames, a desperate, frantic dance on the edge of death. Ellie watched from below, her breath held, praying. He smothered the fire and slid back inside just as another bullet splintered the wood where his head had been. The firefight dwindled into a tense, waiting silence. He's trying something else, Wanblee whispered, his chest heaving. The answer came not with a bang, but with a rending crash. Using the attached animal shed for cover, Whitmore had used a felled log as a battering ram. The weaker wall connecting the shed to the cabin splintered and burst inward. Dust, snow, and splinters exploded into the room, and through the ragged hole, Declan Whitmore lunged, his massive frame blotting out the moonlight. His face was a mask of hate, a pistol clutched in his hand. His wild eyes found Ellie first. He raised the pistol, a grin of triumph spreading across his face. Time seemed to warp, stretching into an agonizing crawl. Ellie fumbled to bring the long barrel of the Winchester around, but she knew she was too slow. This was the end. She never saw Wanblee move. He dropped from the loft above, not with a sound, but like a hawk falling from the sky. He landed in a silent crouch and launched himself at Whitmore before the man could process the new threat. Wanblee's arm snaked around Whitmore's thick neck, yanking him backward. The pistol discharged with a deafening roar, the bullet burying itself harmlessly in the ceiling rafters. The two men crashed to the floor in a brutal, primal struggle. It was a terrifying contest of opposites. Whitmore's brute strength against Wanblee's fluid, precise skill. Ellie jolted from her paralysis. Her home was being destroyed. Her life was forfeit. The man responsible was on her floor. A wave of pure, unadulterated fury washed over her. She scrambled to the hearth, her hand closing around the familiar, heavy handle of her largest cast-iron skillet. It was a tool of sustenance about to become a weapon of war. With a cry torn from the very depths of her soul, she raised it high and brought it down in a whistling arc, putting every ounce of her fear, her grief, and her rage into the blow. It connected with the side of Whitmore's head with a sickening, wet crack that was louder than any gunshot. Whitmore's eyes rolled back in his head. His body went limp and he collapsed in a heap. Silence. A profound, ringing silence fell over the cabin, broken only by their own ragged, desperate gasps for air. The last of Whitmore's men, hearing the fight's abrupt end, had fled into the darkness. It was over. Wanbley slowly pushed himself to his feet. He stood over Whitmore's prone body, his chest rising and falling like a bellows. He looked at the devastation around them, the splintered walls, the shattered glass, the smell of gunpowder and blood that now stained her home. Then his eyes found Ellie. She stood trembling, the skillet still held aloft, her knuckles white. He walked toward her. For a terrifying second, she thought he might be angry. Instead, he gently took the heavy skillet from her grasp and set it quietly on the table. His eyes softened as he saw the gash on her forehead where a flying splinter had cut her. With a tenderness that seemed impossible from a man who had just fought like a demon, he reached out and brushed a stray, blood-matted lock of hair from her face. He looked into her eyes, and in their dark depths, she saw a universe of shared combat, of gratitude, and of a respect so profound it needed no words. He didn't need to speak. She understood. The next morning, Sheriff Brody Miller from Deadwood rode in with a posse. He'd finally decided to act on Agatha Gable's concerns, only to ride into the aftermath of a small war. They found a bound and groggy Declan Whitmore, whose claims of self-defense were quickly dismantled when Seaton, with Wanbley providing a solemn translation, recounted the true story of his father's murder. The farewell, when it came, was held in the cold, bright light of a world scrubbed clean. Seitan, the little sentinel, stood before her and gave her the formal, solemn bow of a warrior to an equal. Little Matto, who had retrieved his precious carved bird, simply hugged her leg, his cheek pressed against the rough fabric of her dress. Finally, Wanbley stood before her. How do you thank someone for the lives of your brothers? Words were cheap, inadequate things. He reached up and with great care untied the single perfect golden eagle feather from his hair. It was not an ornament. It was a symbol of immense honor, a sacred connection between the bearer and the Great Spirit. He held it out to her on his open palm. For a warrior's heart, he said, his voice a low, resonant timbre. The English was slow, deliberate. Our families are now one. Tioshpaya, he said, the word for family, a solemn vow. If you ever have need, look to the hills. We will come. Ellie took the feather. It was impossibly light, yet it felt as if it held the weight of the entire world. She stood on the porch of her battered, broken home and watched them ride away, the warrior and the two boys she had pulled from the jaws of the blizzard. They didn't vanish, but seemed to merge back into the landscape, becoming one with the snow and the pines. She stood there for a long, long time, the forgotten Winchester leaning against the wall, the eagle feather clutched tight in her hand. The cabin was a wreck, her quiet life shattered. But as she looked out at the silent, majestic hills, she no longer felt like a widow clinging to a ghost. The fear was gone, replaced by a deep, resonant strength. She was Elizabeth Linwood, the woman with a warrior's heart, and she was home. Elizabeth's story teaches us that our shared humanity can be a light in the darkest blizzard, and that a single brave choice can change the course of not just one life, but many. If this story of bravery and unlikely friendship moved you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss another journey into the untold stories that shaped our world. And I have to ask you, if you were Ellie alone in that storm and you heard that cry, what would you have done? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching.